After this I looked, and there before me was a great multitude, that no one could count, from every nation, tribe, language, and people, standing before the throne and before the Lamb. And they were wearing white robes and were holding palm branches in their hands. And they cried out in a loud voice, "Salvation belongs to our God, who sits on the throne, and to the Lamb." You know, God's story begins with this command to go out into the world, to cause all things to flourish, to be filled for the glory of God. Culture and diversity were God's idea. And the great story of God will one day culminate with ingathering of the nations from every beautiful people and tribe and language around the throne, celebrating the Lamb. Diversity is God's idea. We certainly live in a complex world. We log on to our mobile devices, we turn on the news, and we're inundated with the complexities of the world, oftentimes rooted in difference. Ethnic differences, geopolitical differences, ideological differences. The complexity of our world is expanding, and I believe it's only going to get worse. The reality is that as believers, we need to take on the posture of our God, who seeks to salvage all things for the great story of God. God is never caught off guard. God is never surprised by the complexity of the world in which we live. And I believe that what it means to live relevantly in this complex world is to take on the posture of God, to seek those nexus point moments in the stories of our day, and to connect people's story to the great story of God. The word nexus refers to the critical nature of a story, the very center of a matter. And as we listen to the story of our time, as we listen to the story of the people around us, we realize that there are all kinds of ways that the stories connect to the great story of God. Relevance faith, and by today's standards, means appreciating complexity, appreciating diversity, and pressing into culture in a way that seeks to salvage the story of our time for the great story of God. I think Christians should give up on this concept of culture wars. We're not warring against culture. Our battle is against the principalities and the powers that seek to oppress people, to lock them into darkness, to bring them into bondage, and to keep them from the light of Jesus Christ. No, our battle is a different kind of battle. Culture is not our enemy. Culture was God's idea. You know, whenever controversial news hits, we're oftentimes caught off guard, we're surprised, but God is never surprised. And what we need to do is to look for those nexus elements of the story to connect the story of our time to the great story of God. I was recently talking to a friend about the devastating droughts in the west part of the country. California is currently going through a historic drought that has devastating consequences for millions of people. And as this person was beginning to talk about their feelings about the drought, it was obvious that they were very concerned. They were frightened. They were talking about the public shaming and the YouTube videos that people were posting on their neighbors, trying to shame them for overwatering their grass. And this person was wondering where it was all going to head. If there was never an end to the drought, what would happen to the millions of people in California? I asked a simple question. I said, what do you think it is about dwindling resources? What do you think it is about difficult times that causes the worst of people to come out? And as I began to listen to that person, just to carefully listen to some of their fears and concerns, I saw several points where their story intersected the story of God. See, the media events, the news events, the differences of culture, the differences of race and ethnicity, none of these things are our enemy. We need to love people, and never at the expense of truth, and we need to tell the truth never at the expense of love. This is what it means to follow Jesus in a world of complexity. Marislav Volf, in his book Exclusion and Embrace, says it like this. He says, if we vilify all boundaries and pronounce every discrete identity oppressive, if we put the tag exclusion on every stable difference, you will have aimless drifting instead of clear-sighted agency, haphazard activity instead of moral engagement and accountability, and in the long run, he says, a tarpour of death instead of the dance of freedom. There are real differences. Socioeconomic differences, and as we've seen in America recently, certainly racial and ethnic differences, and those differences are real. They're to be celebrated. They're to be acknowledged, not as the problem. Diversity isn't the problem. Complexity isn't the problem. It's how we enter into the story of the people around us, oftentimes, that generates more problems than there really are. You know, as we look for those nexus points in the story of our time, and we connect it to the story of God, I believe that we are becoming more like Jesus. We're entering into culture rather than fighting against culture. God is in culture. God is not only using culture, God is in culture, revealing himself to us and causing all things to culminate. For that one day when in Revelation chapter 11 tells us that the kingdoms of this world will become the kingdom of our Lord and of his Christ, that he will reign forever and ever. And the first agenda in this new kingdom is to gather the nations in all of their complexity, in all of their cultural diversity, and to celebrate. And what it actually means to follow Jesus in this day is to realize that culture is not our enemy, that God is in the process of causing all things to flourish for his great glory, and that God is inviting us to enter into the story of our time and to connect it with the great story of God.